I've got a little secret for you. If you ever want to get some attention, just say you're going to climb Denali, and then do it. The attention shows up in a lot of ways. It shows up in excitement and enthusiasm. It shows up in worry. When I announced to my family that I was going to climb Denali, one of my nephews said, why not Everest? My brothers and brother-in-laws were excited about that. A few days later, I got a call from my dad, and he said, honey, can I come down and talk to you? And when my dad calls and says, honey, can I come down and talk to you? It's not a good conversation. And he came down and he said, you know, Kim, when you said you were going to climb Denali, your mom and I, we didn't know much about Denali. But we've done some research. And people die on that mountain. It shows up as people thinking you're crazy. They can't believe that you would inexplicably choose to do something where there is a possibility that you could die. They can't believe that you would pick a mountain that can be colder than Everest, that gets walloped with some of the world's worst storms. And people who know me well know that I hate the cold. One of the things I love to do is water ski, but when I am just contemplating jumping in the lake, I start shaking before I get in the lake. They think I'm crazy because why would you do something that requires months of training and features carrying a 50 to 55 pound pack around the Wasatch Trails here, and then the payoff? 21 days on the highest mountain in North America, just below the Arctic Circle, in potentially fierce weather, without a shower, in the same clothes, sleeping in a small tent on the cold ground, and they decide crazy, definitely crazy. And then there are those who respond with wonder. And that is a combination of enthusiasm and thinking you're crazy. So then you go ahead and do it. And when you get back and you see Robert Newman a few days later and say that you have, and he says, what have you been up to? And you say, you've just gotten back from climbing Denali. He invites you to come to Humanity's Happy Hour, where you have people who want to hear about your summer vacation. It just doesn't happen very much. So I have 20 minutes to talk about what has been one of the most, if not the most, remarkable experience of my life. And if you're interested in having the hour version, I'm happy to share that with you at another time. Bob Goldberg, which I'm impressed by, has heard the hour version and is here tonight to go through the abbreviated version. I titled the talk, McKinley, Denali, the Great One. Many people that I have talked to and I say I've climbed Mount McKinley or I've climbed Denali don't realize that it's one and the same. So it's all the same name for the same mountain. McKinley was after President McKinley, of course. Denali is the Alaskan Indian name, and it means the Great One. I want to begin and end with the same question. Why do it? And to begin, I'll answer it by quoting from the architect of the World's Fair in Chicago, Daniel Burnham, when he said, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir man's blood." And actually, I think what Robert shared with us too, in terms of the Shaw quote, the idea of being thoroughly used up before you die. So the story of Denali doesn't start on June 1st when we started climbing. The story of Denali begins 7 months earlier when we started training. In addition to the regular running and gym workouts that I was already doing, my climbing partner and I added weeknight and weekend hikes in the Wasatch. We went in Neff's Canyon, Thames. We went to the Salt Lake Overlook. We did Desolation Canyon. We spent a weekend on the Pfeifferhorn, climbing the north face of the Pfeifferhorn. On a Wednesday night, or a Thursday night, or particularly on a Wednesday night or a Thursday night at 6 o'clock. I would slip away from the pressures of work and social activity and engagements to the quiet of the mountains. Minutes from my house, I would be in Neff's Canyon in the dark. I've never hiked in the dark like that with my headlamp. The trees would be laden with snow, a canopy over the top. It was so quiet. It was remote. It was peaceful. I breathed a different air. My pace slowed, not just because I was carrying a 50-pound pack. It was rhythmic and measured. In the end, I was tired and rejuvenating. These are pictures of when we climbed the north face of the Pfeifferhorn and took a weekend to go up there. This is what we have in our own backyard, and that was one of the things that I've skied in the wintertime, but I've never experienced the hiking and climbing, ice climbing, and those sorts of things in the wintertime. It was spectacular. But to be honest, by May, I was sick to death of hiking, and I was ready to do the real thing. When you climb Denali, you begin in a small, eclectic town called Talkeetna. This is a little town where the dogs roam free. They're in the streets, they're in the restaurants. The beer flows freely. It's good on tap, and you'd have a hard time finding a good bottle of wine. You start in this little town, you go to a little tiny airport, you get into a little tiny plane, and this is our climbing group. There were 4 climbers and 2 guides. One of our climbers, the woman that you can see in the middle, she was from Switzerland. She was an anesthesiologist from Switzerland. It was delightful to have her in the group. This is at 9 o'clock at night. The storms had been so bad that there was some chance that we weren't going to get into Denali that night, but they cleared out, and the last flight they can go out on is at 9 o'clock. Note how bright it is. Remember that in Alaska at this time of year, it never gets dark, so you never need a headlamp. You can read in your tent at 10 o'clock at night if you can stand to have your hands outside the sleeping bag. So we flew in a little plane, little bush plane, taxied down the runway, and then took off and experienced some of the most spectacular scenery I've ever seen. If the only thing I had done, and I know that some of you in this room have had the opportunity to fly out of Talkeetna and to fly up and circle the summit of Denali, the view was just spectacular. And when we got close to the mountain range, you were in this little tiny plain among these majestic mountains. And then you come around these mountains in a big sweeping bank turn, and you see the Wirthlin Glacier. And when we landed, it had been snowing hard for 2 weeks. And there had not been planes that had been going in and out of onto the Wirthlin Glacier. And so the powder just billowed up into the wings. And there was a small village there of people and who had been waiting, for the most part, for the planes to fly so that they could get out. We spent the night here, and then I just thought this was interesting. So one of the things I'll tell you about this, so these people have been waiting to get out, and these are the first 2 planes that have been in days. And they're calling the lucky ones who get to board these 2 planes because this is the last flight for the night. And I was talking to one of the people who had been there, and he was a little chagrined that after finishing, they'd been on the mountain for 20 days, that they were spending another day on the mountain waiting to get out. We woke the next morning when we got up to begin. It was an awesome day. We were surrounded by these majestic peaks, as you can see. We loaded our packs and loaded our sleds and headed off. Now, when you are packing for 21 days on the mountain, one of the things that makes Denali a little more difficult than some of the other big mountains is that you don't have Sherpas or porters to help carry your gear. And so you have to carry all the provisions, all the fuel, everything you need to survive on the mountain for 21 days. So between my pack and my sled, I had about 120 pounds. Now I just want you to take note of the weight ratio. Before I left for Denali, I was talking to a really good friend of mine who was a guide. He used to have a guiding business. And he took people on a lot of big mountains. And he said to me, you know, we used to have a saying among the guides. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, we said that women don't belong above 16,000 feet. I said, really? Why don't they belong above 16,000 feet? He said, well, for you, I'm going to give you 17. I said, that's not helping. Why don't they belong above 16,000 feet? And he said, well, they cry. I said, they cry? And he said, yeah, it gets so hard, it gets so tiresome, you're worn out. And he said, guys, they want to cry, but they don't cry. Girls, they cry. And I said, I'm not crying. I will not cry. So the first part of this first day, we are not going a lot of elevation. You go from 7,200 feet to about 7,800 feet, but it is a great distance. And this gives you a sense of it. We're actually, from the piece you can see on the left, we're covering that whole area in front and then beyond. Let me go back. And so for the first 4 hours, everything was beautiful. I was taking it in. You're on a rope line, so there's about 20 feet between you and the nearest person. So you're really on your own. It is about you and the mountain. It is a physical and mental challenge. At about 5 hours, the weight ratio was getting challenging, and we were going more uphill. And I was pulling forward, and sometimes I was able to hold that step, but most often the sled was pulling me back. And I was thinking, I'm not sure I can keep this up. But in the distance, I saw a campsite, and I thought, oh, I can get to that camp. And so I'm literally straining, pulling forward. And we got to the campsite, and we walked past. And in the far distance, I could make out this other base camp, and I thought, I can get there. I will absolutely get there. And I'm straining with everything I've got, pulling forward and having it pull me back, and pulling forward and having it pull me back. And we got to the second base camp, and we walked past. And I started to cry. I thought, I have worked so hard. I have trained so hard. And on the first day, I can't make it. We'd been told that we'd come to everybody would face a breaking point. You know, when your breaking point happens on the first day, you don't know if that's your only breaking point or if there's another breaking point that is on the horizon. And I didn't see any other camps up ahead. All I saw ahead was this really steep hill, and there was no way I could get up that hill. So I thought, well, it's a really big bummer, but I'm just going to have to tell everybody that we have to stop at the base of that hill because I don't have the physical capacity to get up it. And much to my relief, we set up our camp at the base of that hill. And when one of the things you have to be careful of on Denali are glaciers and holes that you can't see, and so you stay on the rope line as they pull you into the area where you're going to set up camp. And so as I was getting pulled in on the rope, and they were saying, "Congratulations, way to go," I was so grateful for sunglasses. And I walked away and had a little bit of alone time. When you get into camp, the first thing you do is you start building your camp. And one of the things you do is you dig a hole, a large hole, so that you can create a kitchen. And so these are, you get your tent set up, and then you can see the dome-shaped tent is actually the kitchen. And now I'm happy in the tent. Everything's good. I've recovered. I think I might make it. But then you get into the kitchen and you warm up and you're cooking. You have hot tea and cocoa and cider or whatever you want. And that becomes the ritual every evening. You essentially, for the lower half of the mountain, the only way that you can really move all your stuff up the mountain is to do it in 2 trips. So the only day we had our full load was on the first day, gratefully. The second day, we did a carry. So what you do is you take everything you're not going to be using for that night and the next day, and you carry it. We went from 7,800 feet to 9,800 feet. And then you come back to 7,800 and you spend the night. So the next day when we got up to go up to 9,800, it was a cold, windy, blustery day. We came back to our 7,800 foot base camp, stayed there that night, and the next day we were welcomed with one of the most beautiful days we had on the mountain. Although we were fortunate with good weather. On that day, we moved from 7,800 to 11,000. This is the first and what turned out to be the only clear shot we ever saw of the summit of Denali. The middle peak is, the top is the summit of Denali. So this is as we're making our way up to the 11,000 foot base camp. And as you're going on this rope line, as I mentioned before, it really is a solitary experience. I mean, when you rest, you stay in the rope line. You don't have anybody to chat with. It's a very rhythmic, meditative step. It really is about you physically and mentally determining that you can get to wherever you're going. This is the 11,000 foot base camp. And at the 11,000 foot base camp and higher, you build wind walls. The winds can be so severe that the wind walls really do protect from that severe wind. And so that is literally cutting the blocks of ice. These wind walls have fallen down, but cutting the blocks of ice out of the glacier with saws and then building these wind walls. And the difference is truly amazing. We were lucky. The people before us were not so lucky. Prior to getting there, there had been such severe storms on Denali that people were stuck at the 14,000 foot base camp for 14 days. And so when that broke, they just ended up coming down. Our good fortune was that all the wind walls were built. So at the 11,000 foot base camp, we just had to shore them up. And then, as I described before, you do the carry and the move, and till you get up to the 14,000 foot base camp. And when we were moving up to the 14,000 foot base camp, we started out with cold, stormy weather. There's a place on the mountain that's called Windy Corner, which is aptly named. The first day we went around Windy Corner, the winds were 45 miles an hour. The second time we went around it, they were about 55 miles an hour. And I'll tell you, 50 to 55 miles an hour, it has the capacity to blow me over. And so when the big gusts would come up, you'd literally just go down and hold. But once we got around Windy Corner, this is on the fiercest day, we were greeted with just spectacular weather. And then when you get to the 14,000 foot base camp, you can kind of break the climb into different sections. You have the first section of getting to the 14,000 foot base camp, the 14,000 foot base camp, then getting to your high camp, and then getting to the summit. The 14,000 foot base camp is a little village. It's a community. I was surprised by the number of languages that were spoken there. There were people from all around the world. You were as likely to speak to someone who spoke, who was from the USA as you were there were Russians, there were Germans, there were Italians, there were just a wide variety of people. And again, as you can see, all these little campsites had been built. We didn't have to build them. They had been built before, so it saved us a lot of effort. And when we got to the 14,000-foot base camp, you take your first rest day. And we were lucky with really nice weather. You hear people's stories as they're getting ready to go and as they're coming down from their climb. You have to be very careful of the sun. I happened to take my ring off, and I didn't have gloves on. I got burned where my ring was, and so this is me reading a book. We also spent time and went out to a place at the 14,000-foot base camp that's called the Top of the World, and the name is well deserved. This is just a picture of my rope team at the Top of the World. I got up one night about 4 o'clock in the morning and was welcomed with this beautiful pictures of Mount Hunter and Mount Foraker. It was just stunning. So most people, when they climb Denali, the route that they do is the West Buttress route, which is the route to the left that you can see there. The route that that we did was the Upper West Rib, which goes along to the right, and you can see it just goes right up that ridge to the right. The beauty of doing the West Rib is that we were one of two groups on the West Rib. On the West Buttress, they have many, many people. So this is one picture of all those little dots are all the people going up to the West Buttress. And so every day that it was a beautiful day, you just see this line of people that were going up to the West Buttress to climb. So one of the things I loved about the Upper West Rib route, and if you could see this, sort of blew up funny, this picture, it shows the whole Upper West Rib, and we're the only people on our way up there. So we spent a day at the 14,000-foot base camp getting rested, and then we did a carry up to our high camp, which was at 16.3. And so you take everything up to the high camp that you think you're going to use for the time you'll be up there to attempt a summit. And you plan on spending 4 days up there, so you have plenty of time for weather. And if you're lucky enough to do it in a couple of days, that's just your good fortune. But you take enough up there that you can stay up there for 4 or 5 days. And when we got up to our high camp, which is at 16.3, you can just barely, and those in the back probably can't see it, but you can barely make out a tent that's just above the two people that are going up there. And we were going to set up our high camp in a little, it was sort of a saddle up there, and there were two people that were camped above us, John and Drew, and they had done the complete West Rib, which is a very technical, challenging route up Denali. And when they saw that we were down there, they had been waiting out for good weather, so they had been there for a couple of days. They were really good guys, but they were also, I think, a little bored. And we had the good fortune of having them come down and help us build our high camp. So John and Drew are in the orange and the blue. And I'll tell you, at 16.3, I felt the altitude at 14. But at 16.3, when you cut one of those blocks of ice out of the glacier, you saw, and breathe, breathe, breathe. It takes a lot of energy, and it is not easy to breathe at that altitude. So having their help really did help us a tremendous amount. Now, John and Drew, John was from Boston. He was just finishing his neurosurgery residency in his neurosurgery residency at Brigham and Women's, and Drew was an orthopedic surgeon. When they were helping us, all of a sudden John stopped and he took out his satellite phone and he called home. And he talked to his wife and he talked to his son, and he said, after he hung up, he said to each of us, "Who wants to use my satellite phone to call home?" So the most important thing you can do is to stay in touch. So one of our people did borrow the phone. As I said, they had come up the complete West Rib. They were 9 years earlier. They had attempted the West Rib, and they had given up their attempt to help on a rescue, and were given the Denali Pro Award for safety and conscientiousness in climbing. John had climbed Everest. They were very experienced climbers. Their plan was to, the next day, if the weather was good, was to climb up the rest of the West Rib. But Drew had been having some stomach troubles and was not wanting to spend quite as much time, and so talked with our guide about the possibility of going up the West Rib, but then descending the West Buttress route, which is a little easier descent. As I said before, the West Rib is a pretty steep ascent and descent. The downside of doing that, of course, is that you have to carry your full load up the West Rib if you're going to descend another way. So when we left, we built our high camp, and then we went back to the 14,000-foot base camp. And they were going to start the next day for their summit bid if it was a good day. And we were going to be resting the next day. So we said, see us before you head down if you go. As it turned out, the next day wasn't a good day, and they didn't end up going. The following day, we headed up we did our move up to our high camp. And we got up to our high camp about early afternoon, and Drew and John were gone. We set up our high camp, and this is just one of the most spectacular places I've ever seen in the whole world. So as I said, we're in this little notch. And as you look out to the left side, you see the view behind me, to the side of me there. When you look out to the right side, you see down below the 14,000-foot base camp, about 2,000 feet below. And when you look out in front, you're above the clouds, and it's just us. It's so quiet and so beautiful. That evening, we'd had dinner, and which we usually did, you get the weather report around 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and so we were all in our tents, but as you saw, they're very close together, so you can hear everything that's going on in between the tents, and we could hear our guide's radio and what was going to happen on the weather. And after the weather report, he got a call from one of his friends and guiding colleagues who was with two other friends and guiding colleagues, and they were planning to ski the Orient Express, which is just off of the West Rib. It's part of the West Rib route. These guides, once they're acclimated, they go up and down Denali like it's going up and down to Snowbird. So they didn't have clients. They were just going to skin up and ski the Orient Express. And they started off about 5 o'clock, and as they were headed up the West Rib, they saw coming down to their left, there's a couloir called the Mesner Couloir, and they saw two bodies that came cascading down that couloir and fell 2,000 feet. And when they went, they were the first to get to the two people that had fallen, and when they got to the two people that had fallen, it was John and Drew. And so it was, we had been blessed with remarkable weather. We had had a safe trip up to that point. it was a surreal experience to have been with these two people just the day before, 2 days before, and to know of their experience. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but what we think happened, because they were fully loaded, is that they had decided to go up the west rib and then descend the west buttress. And on the descent, they got mixed up. And they got off the trail and ended up in the Mesner Couloir, which is a very steep couloir. And as you saw, the way that you travel on the glacier travel is by being roped up. And you do that so that you can arrest if someone were to fall into a hole or a crevasse. And on this very steep couloir, one of them slipped and they both fell to their death. So it was one of the heartbreaking, tragic experiences on an otherwise really remarkable climb. The next day, if it was good weather, we were going to go for the summit. And so the night before your summit attempt, at least I think this is probably the same experience that a lot of people have, you're nervous and anxious, didn't sleep very well. You wonder, am I going to be strong enough tomorrow after all this work and given my first day? Actually, I was over my first day. I thought I could make it. Will I have what it takes to ascend 4,000 feet and descend 4,000 feet? And a summit day on the west rib takes about 26 hours. You sleep with everything. It's so cold, you sleep with your water bottles, your boots, all your clothes. That's more information than you want, but your pee bottle. You sleep with everything in your sleeping bag. So we got up the next day. It was a beautiful day. We headed off. And we were going well. Everybody in our group you can see our little camp that's looking back at it. We were heading up well, and we got to just the lower part of the Orient Express. And as I mentioned, the Orient Express is the most dangerous part on the west rib. It can be very, very icy, and it's very steep. It's called the Orient Express for a reason. And on the day we were going, though it started off beautiful, it ended up snowing. And this gives you a picture of the west rib that I pulled off the website. But we were above where you can see the rock and onto the snow, and just headed up to just beginning the Orient Express, which is at about 18,300, and the summit is at 20,300 feet. And because it was snowing so much, our guides wanted to be able to belay everybody across the Orient Express. So, because they were afraid of little slough-offs or little avalanches. And as we sat down to rest and eat and drink, one of the people in our group said, "I have nothing left. I'm completely out of gas." Now, to give you a little bit of background, this person, whose name is George, at 14,000 feet started to talk about how the altitude was maybe getting to him, but he didn't have any altitude sickness. When we got up to our high camp, the day before we went, he said to our guide, "What happens if one of us can't make it?" And I thought, oh my gosh, you've got to have your head in a different place. But our guide said to him, it depends, but it's likely that one of the guides could take whoever couldn't make it down and the rest could continue. So he gets up to 18,300 and says, "I'm out of gas." And we all said, "Oh, come on, George. Have you eaten? Have you drinking? What have you been drinking? How much have you?" Yeah, this is good. Humanities. And I'm even drinking water, not beer. "We'll carry things in your pack." And he said, "No, I'm done. I'm spent." And our guide said, "Well, George, if we have to take you down, we all have to go down." And George said, "That's, for the sake of the group, baloney." He said, "You told me that if one of us couldn't go up, then you could take the other one down and the rest could continue." And our guide said, "That depends on the conditions. And the conditions are such that I can't have somebody take you down with a rope and safely get everybody else across the Orient Express, especially on the descent if it continued to snow as hard as it was. So, you know, at that point, recognizing that we have 2,000 feet, which is not much to the summit, problem is we have a 4,000-foot descent. And most accidents, most fatalities happen on the descent. As one of the great climbers, Ed Viesters, said, getting to the summit is optional. Getting down is mandatory. And when I climbed Mount Rainier, my guide said, the true summit is the parking lot. My friends and family found great comfort when I told them that I believed that to be the case. So we all sat there for a while, really coming to grips with the fact that we only had one decision. If at this point George was out of gas, we may be able to get him to the top, but it could be a nightmare getting him down. And so we turned around and we came down, and the weather got much worse, and we got back to our camp, and it had taken us about 10 hours to do that round trip. And when we got back, our guide said to my climbing partner and I, the West Rib is too steep, it's too big a day to try to think that you're going to rest a day and we're going to make another attempt. We've made our attempt on the West Rib. So what we could do is we could go down tomorrow, we could rest a day, and then we could try the West Buttress. And if we have really good weather, we might make it. And Mike and I thought, we decided pretty quickly that we had come to do the West Rib, and we'd had our attempt. And it's not just about the summit. It's a 50-50 chance no matter what. And so we decided that rather than trying to hustle down and then hustle up the other side, we would we had made our attempt for the summit. Now, I got to tell you, the next morning when I woke up, and it looked like that, there were a lot of great things I brought off that mountain. But one thing I brought off that mountain was resentment. I just decided I'm not getting over this with George. I won't be naming a child after George. This is not going to be a character experience for me. So we descended to the 14,000-foot base camp. We rested a day. And then at 8:30 that night, we were ready to descend. And you make the descent all in 12 hours. You just go straight through. And it was a complete whiteout on that day. And one of my good friends, this shows you a small world it is. One of my good friends, two of my good friends actually, Martin Fry on your right and Steve Gasser on your left, were coming up to climb Denali 2 weeks later and came into the 14,000-foot base camp just as we were getting ready to go down. And out of this whiteout, all of a sudden I hear, "Hey, is there a Kim Wirthlin up there?" And Martin is here. And so Martin and Steve had a successful climb up Denali. But the good news for us, had Mike and I, good news in terms of our decision, had Mike and I decided to try to do the West Buttress route, what I learned from Martin and Steve is the weather didn't get much better, and we would have run out of time. And Martin and Steve were stuck for 6 days at the high camp. So we would not have had a chance to summit if we had tried to do that. Beautiful descent once the clouds cleared out. Almost a surreal look. And we got to the landing strip at 7:30 in the morning. Our guide had ice cold Miller beer, nothing like that, at 7:30 in the morning after a climb. The plane came an hour later, and we were off. So let me end with the question I began. Why do it? Here's why. Let me just describe one night on our high camp at 16-3. It had been snowing all day. It was 10 o'clock at night. I went out. I was all alone. The sun was coming out of the clouds. There were little ice crystals dancing in the air. On my left was that beautiful picture of those majestic mountains going up. In front of me were the mountain peaks out of the clouds. On the right was that beautiful view of the 14,000-foot base camp and all the way down that glaciated valley. It was so quiet, and the beauty was so immense. And I felt so grateful to have a chance to be there, to experience that. So since returning, I have only to be quiet and to remember, and I'm there, experiencing that peace and that awesome grandeur. And as Robert began, experiencing the splendid torch of life. Thank you.